When it comes to aviation, the interwar years, especially the latter ones during the 1930s, were a fascinating time for France, characterized by rapid technological development, innovation, and some curiously interesting aircraft, though not always flattering on the eyes. It's something that can be immediately demonstrated by taking a look at their commercial sphere of aviation, and more specifically, the realm of seaplanes and flying boats. In this corner of French aviation, we can find something as fascinating as it is forgotten. A line of absolutely enormous and gorgeous flying boats, all designed to carry out the prestigious transatlantic crossing in luxury and style. One of these aircraft, the Sud Est SE-200 Amphitrite, is the main focus of today's video, but we're also going to touch on two others as well, the Latecoere 631 and the Potez-CAMS 161, as the fates of all three were bound by a shared thread of misfortune. A gorgeous design, the Amphitrite was seemingly plagued by bad luck. It was, from the commercial standpoint, a complete failure. But the Amphitrite is a pretty fascinating aircraft that, in virtually any other context, would likely be a lot more famous than it currently is. The political situation of France at the time, the outbreak of the Second World War, and the transience of the transatlantic Golden Age are all major contributors to this elegant aircraft being relatively unknown, the same for its other French cousins. As such, I thought I'd take the opportunity today to examine them in a bit more detail, why they were made, and ultimately why they failed. Their origins begin in 1936, and although the South Atlantic is by this point a regular route taken by aircraft carrying mail and occasionally passengers, the North Atlantic remains problematic. Throughout much of the 1920s, lots of the groundwork for a major shift in air travel was laid out, particularly in Britain. Just 13 years before, in 1923, the very first sustainable flying boat service was set up, flying to and from the Channel Islands. These routes were a natural fit for flying boats, able to carry passengers and cargo to locations that normal aircraft couldn't reach, and at a speed much faster than any sea-going vessel. By 1931, Britain had recognised the potential of this type of aircraft to interconnect its vast empire, transporting people and information from the four corners of the globe in record time, and by the middle of that same decade, they had already started to pump out aircraft such as the Short Empire to meet this new need. It was a time of rapid change, and connecting the old continent to the new one in a novel way through aircraft was shaping up to be a very lucrative endeavour. Naturally, with France trying to expand its own aviation industry, both commercial and military, a Gallic proposition on this route seemed inevitable. Indeed, in early 1936, after celebrating the 100th crossing of the South Atlantic by Air France, the Directorate General for Civil Aviation would put out a tentative specification outlining a transatlantic airliner. This aircraft, intended for use by Air France, would need a range of 6,000 kilometers, a cruising speed of at least 250 kilometers per hour at 70% engine power, and a carrying capacity of at least 20 passengers plus 500 kilograms of cargo. All of this within an airframe that would not exceed 40 tons. It was not an easy specification to meet, but it had the potential to be a very profitable one, and so ultimately, three companies would begin work on a design to meet it, these being Latecoere, Lioré et Olivier, and C.A.M.S., which stood for Chantier Aéro Maritime de la Sienne, and I apologize to all of my French viewers if I butchered that pronunciation. All three were successful companies with a strong backlog of proven designs behind them. Unfortunately, things got off to a bad start, and design work with the companies had barely begun when their first stroke of bad luck occurred. At the end of 1936, work on the designs by all three companies was upended when the French aircraft industry was nationalised, following which the specification itself was also altered. This was made even more complex by the fact that the three companies had not even received the same specification to begin with. What the Director General had initially written out did not match the letters that each manufacturer had then later received from the French Air Ministry. For example, Latecoere had been instructed to build something that could carry 40 passengers, which is double what had been quoted to Lioré et Olivier. It must have been a bit of a nasty surprise to the latter company when a new specification, outlining double the passenger count originally quoted, landed in their office, and they were more than a little annoyed at learning their competitor, Latecoere, had received that same information from the very beginning. The updated specifications now called for a larger aircraft of 70 tons. It recommended 4 to 8 engines as a power plant configuration, and the range of 6,000 kilometers now had to be completed at an average speed of 270 kilometers per hour with a 70-kilometer headwind. Now, it should be pointed out that the seaplane record at the time managed just over 5,000 kilometers at an average speed of 157 kilometers per hour, so these requirements were setting a really, really high bar. Nevertheless, work continued, and by 1938, despite the clear time advantage that Latecoere had enjoyed, all three designs had been more or less worked out on paper. Whether by necessity, or perhaps a centralization of information after the three companies were nationalized, all three designs went for a 6-engine layout. A fourth company, Breguet, had also submitted a design to this specification, but no significant records of it exists, as they lacked the experience for such an endeavour, and they were advised by the Air Ministry to withdraw, which they did. Experience was a key requirement for the competing companies. Latecoere had proven themselves with the 521, a flying boat that broke several world records in endurance and payload, and was enjoying a successful career as an airliner with Air France. Funnily enough, after numerous modifications, the 521 eventually did make 4 North Atlantic crossings between mid-1938 and mid-1939, although this was hardly the use case originally intended for it. Lioré et Olivier, meanwhile, had the H-47 on their resume, a 4-engine airliner which had just entered an evaluation period with Air France. These flying boats would go on to prove themselves not only as mail carriers, but in service with the French Navy after the outbreak of World War II. C.A.M.S., now Potez-CAMS, following its nationalization, was the weakest of the three. Though also known for flying boats, most of their designs were smaller and built for the French Navy. However, due to their extensive experience in flying boat construction in general, their proposal was still considered. Regardless as to whether their experience was military or civil, all three companies did know how to make a good flying boat. The question now was which one could channel that experience into a superior design. Lioré et Olivier's design, originally dubbed the H-49, was now redesignated the Sud Est 200 Amphitrite, after the Amphitrite of Greek mythology, wife of Poseidon, and queen of the seas. A fitting name for such an elegant and impressive design. At just over 40 meters in length, 52 in span, and weighing 32 tons empty, the SE200 was the middle of the three in terms of size, just shy of the Latecoere in wingspan and mass, and significantly larger than the Potez-CAMS 161, which was quite a lot smaller than either of them, weighing just 17 tons empty. All three designs featured an all-metal, high-cantilever wing design with double decks, and the latest in flying boat hull construction. The 631 and the Sud Est 200 featured Gnome Horn radials, whilst the Potez-CAMS 161 instead opted for a Hispano-Suiza 12Y inline engine. This had less power, but was far more streamlined. Competition between the three companies was fierce. To try and get more public exposure, Lioré et Olivier went so far as to produce a large-scale diorama of an Amphitrite to present at the 1938 Paris Air Show, to drum up hype in the press. After some detailed evaluation of the Latecoere 631 and the Sud Est 200 on paper, the Air Ministry eventually decided that both were worth ordering. The committee gave a slight performance edge to the 631, which was calculated to have a cruising speed which was 40 km an hour faster than the SE-200. The SE-200's hull, however, was more spacious and presented more options in terms of layout. Above all though, and the factor that probably kept the Amphitrite in the race above all else, was the fact that the SE-200 was quoted at a price of 41.4 million francs, which was 4.6 million less than that of the Latecoere. Air France, perhaps more pessimistic in thinking and also terrified of these price tags, proposed to simply forget about both of these giant designs and settle for the less ambitious Potez-CAMS 161, which would be cheaper, faster to produce, and available to put into service much sooner. Not an ambitious proposal perhaps, but they may have had the right idea considering what eventually happened. The Air Ministry didn't seriously humour this proposition though, but they did at least allow Potez-CAMS to continue to compete for the tender and build an example of the 161, which was something they almost certainly would not have done otherwise. Thus, at the end of 1938, all of the designs were approved for construction, which began immediately. Due to the enormity of these aircraft, and the incredible amount of time it would take to produce even one of these giants, it was decided by Lioré et Olivier to produce multiple simultaneously. 4, in fact. Now this of course is something of a risk, because if there is no pre-production prototype for testing, you may end up with multiple aircraft all flawed by a problem that could have been easily fixed earlier on. However, for an aircraft of this size at the time, with France's industrial and financial problems, there wasn't really much of a viable alternative, and so both Latecoere and Lioré et Olivier began work on multiple airframes at once. The exception was Potez-CAMS, which didn't produce more than one airframe. This was most likely because their design had received the least amount of interest from the Civil Directorate, and they weren't really holding their breath about receiving a production order. Progress of the construction was slow, but consistent, and by 1940 it was expected that the first Amphitrite would be rolling out of the factory doors by the end of the year. However, things would not go quite to plan in this regard. For one thing, the Second World War had just kicked off, and although the German panzers were not yet rolling through the Ardennes, the French were gearing up for a land war, and this meant a lot of previously available assets and resources had been requisitioned for strictly military use. One such asset was the SE-200's intended power plant, the Bléneau.J 14R, which was a 14-cylinder radial engine. Capable of an impressive 1600 horsepower, it was simply too valuable to waste on an airliner when fighters and bombers, and engines to equip them with, were sorely needed. As such, Lioré et Olivier scrambled to find a suitable replacement that could be found quickly, and eventually they settled on the Wright Cyclone R1820. These, of course, would have to be ordered and shipped in from the US, and although they didn't provide quite the same power output as the Bléneau.J, there weren't any other financially affordable alternatives. The Wright Cyclones arrived in June of 1940, by which time the Germans were storming towards Paris, and a glorious transatlantic airliner was the last thing on the minds of anyone in France. Despite one of the aircraft being very close to completion by this point, the project was temporarily abandoned as the country became occupied. For roughly 12 months, the Amphitrites would sit dormant, unfinished in their factory in Mariana in southern France. Any work on either the Latecoere 631 and Potez-CAMS 161 was also halted during this time, as any prospect for their intended use case seemed unlikely. The market for airlines between the US and a German-occupied Europe was, funnily enough, at an all-time low in terms of demand. Despite this, however, and perhaps a little unexpectedly, the next burst of life for the SE-200 came from the Germans, when it was suddenly realized that they had in their possession an enormous long-range aircraft at a time when that was precisely the type of machine the Germans wanted more of to help out over the Atlantic, and perhaps even undertake marauding patrols to the American coast. For this reason, work on all three French giants was restarted under German orders, with the intention of taking them back to Germany for testing, and perhaps, ultimately, a service life with the Luftwaffe. Despite the Amphitrite being the nearest to completion, the Potez-CAMS 161 was the first taken, repainted in German markings, and flown on the 20th of March 1942. Very little further testing appears to have been done on this aircraft, as full trials and performance measurements were never taken. Instead, the 161 spent the rest of the war moored at Lake Constance, near the southern border of Germany and Switzerland. There was some confusion about the fate of this aircraft until gun camera footage from the US Army Air Force later emerged, showing it under fire and partially submerged at this particular location. As that was the only Potez-CAMS 161 that had been built, that was the end of its story, and we are now down to just 2 flying boat designs. The next to fly was the Sud Est 200. The first Amphitrite was completed in July 1942, but not flown until a few months later. The French, interestingly, were even able to conduct some preliminary testing of their own before the Germans stepped in and took control. These tests included a 25-minute hydroplaning test undertaken by test pilot Jacques Lecarme that determined another step needed to be added to the empennage, and then in October, a full test flight, with the Amphitrite taking off from the water and flying for around 5 minutes at speeds that were not exceeding 220 km per hour. The test was done at a weight of 47 tons and with 8 people on board, making it the first flight of what was then, for a short time, the largest seaplane in Europe. The Latecoere 631, which just edged it out in sheer size, would fly a month later. But even so, the Amphitrite was a deeply impressive machine. It had a wingspan of 52.2 meters, a length of 40 meters, and a height of almost 10 meters. Along with the Latecoere, it would rank among the largest aircraft in the world at the time. Later on the 11th of December, the aircraft would make its first real long test flight, still in the hands of Jacques Lecarme. This time, he brought the aircraft up to a maximum speed of 310 km per hour during a 3-hour-long test flight. From these tests, an increasing in the size of the vertical stabilizer was deemed necessary, although, aside from some other easily rectifiable issues, the aircraft's performance in the air was relatively faultless. Now at this point, the completed aircraft was not equipped with its intended passenger fittings, something the Germans at the time apparently had no interest in, and it was instead left, internally, a blank canvas, accommodating a potential military conversion. Lioré and Olivier continued work on putting together the other 4 aircraft, whilst the Germans had a look at their shiny new toy. Lioré and Olivier had been informed by the State Secretary of Aviation that they would sell 2 Amphitrites to the Germans for a price of 85 million francs, one of which had already been delivered. It was a sale that, of course, could not be refused. A few days later, Lufthansa also got involved, the Amphitrite having apparently caught their eye. They expressed interest in renting transatlantic seaplanes for operation on a new planned network they were hoping to get set up, the post-war route between Nazi-occupied Europe and the United States, something that, of course, would never actually come to pass. In preparation for this proposed route, Lufthansa requested that some modifications be made to the Amphitrites that were still under construction. Namely, that the fixed pontoons should be replaced with retractable ones, and a number of changes be made to the structural makeup of the aircraft, which would lead to a weight savings of almost 3,000 kilograms. At this point, the Luftwaffe appeared to have dwindling interest in the type, as they didn't follow up their initial curiosity with any official evaluations. A decision which is at least mildly perplexing, as the aircraft had extraordinary range and carrying capacity, meaning that both very long patrols over the Atlantic and a military refit were on the cards and well within both aircraft's capabilities. Lufthansa, on the other hand, was still quite keen, and on the 20th of April 1943, a representative was sent down to Mariana to outline the conditions for an official evaluation. Firstly, the underside of the aircraft was to be painted yellow, in accordance with German camouflage regulations. German markings were to be applied to the top and bottom of the wings and fuselage, and 100 profile photos had to be taken from all angles, in order to be dispatched to anti-aircraft batteries in the surrounding area, which would also be informed of the test flights 24 hours in advance. The last thing you wanted was your expensive captured French seaplane getting blown up by trigger-happy defences mistaking it as some sort of new, enormous Allied bomber. Further, a German pilot would have to be on board, and the aircraft would have to stay within a 10-kilometre radius of Mariana during the test flight. The first of these tests were undertaken on June 23, 1943, in a flight lasting approximately 90 minutes, under the watchful eye of the chief pilot of Lufthansa, Werner von Engel. The next day, von Engel himself took control of the aircraft for 15 minutes, and then, over the following weeks, he carried out takeoff and landing tests to evaluate the SE-200's characteristics between 115 and 130 km per hour on the water. Later that year, he would be joined by Helmut Wasser-Rodig, chief test pilot at Blohm+Voss. Together, these two men undertook a number of test flights in early November before returning to Hamburg. Rodig presumably drew comparisons between the Amphitrite and the BV-222 Viking, which he was intimately involved with at the time, as he reviewed it quite favourably. During one of these tests, on the 5th of November, the aircraft was tested at a full load of 70 tons, but both test pilots agreed that the aircraft did not handle this load as well as it should. As a result, the Amphitrite was dry-docked for further modifications intended to improve its flight characteristics at full load. Despite the aircraft clearly being of some interest to the Germans, after these last few test flights in November of 43, it was not revisited by any officials from either Lufthansa or the Luftwaffe. This, however, is likely a result of the war starting to turn sour for the Germans, and not a reflection on the Amphitrite itself, as the German test pilots had far more important things to worry about now, like highly flammable experimental jet and rocket planes, for example. At some point during the winter of 43 to 1944, this aircraft, which was nicknamed Rochenbau by the Germans, was transferred to Lake Constance, whilst the other four airframes were slowly put together at the plant in Mariana. And by slowly, I mean much, much slower than they could have been built, as admittedly the French knew that any completed aircraft would be immediately confiscated and used by the Germans, and most of them did not want that to happen. The first aircraft was never flown again following November 1943, and then in April 1944 it swiftly and unexpectedly met its end at the hands of RAF Mosquito pilots, which strafed it where it was moored. Just 5 months later, a US Army Air Force air raid, which bombed the Mariana plant, completely destroyed the second Amphitrite under construction, and badly damaged the other three. However, by this point, the gloomy mood in the company was changing, and it was considered worthwhile to repair the third and fourth airframe, as the liberation of France appeared to be on the horizon, and that meant that, following the end of the war, the aircraft could get back on track for their original purpose. By 1946, the third Amphitrite, after being worked on for over a year, was finally ready to undertake its maiden flight. Despite being a cause for celebration for the team that had built it, an updated version of the Latecoere 631 had already flown a year earlier, and in fact, Air France was already deep into discussions with Latecoere about a further order, and facilitating the aircraft's entry into service as soon as possible. However, the Latecoere was not the biggest threat to the Amphitrite's success. The mass appeal of transatlantic flying boats had been partially left behind in the pre-war era, and with aircraft like the modern Lockheed Constellation now coming into service, introducing a slow flying boat onto the route wasn't quite as attractive as it had been a decade before when the original specification was drawn up. Nevertheless, the Sud Est 200 was exhibited around France, even conducting a ceremonial flight over the remains of the first destroyed Amphitrite in June. By this time, the fourth prototype was approximately 93% ready, but despite being very close to completion, nobody could think of any real reason why it should be completed, and it was scrapped. With the fifth being just 10% complete, it had no hope of avoiding the scrap heap, leaving just the third Amphitrite as the only one that would linger on. Just 3 years later, after a particularly hard landing that would have necessitated a significant repair, the third Amphitrite was grounded permanently, thereafter being used for engine testing. It survived until early 1963, by which time she was a sad, rusted-out shell of her former self, and she was finally scrapped as well. That brings the story of the second giant flying boat, and the main focus of this video, to an end. However, things hadn't gone much better for the third giant French flying boat. By August of 1948, the Amphitrite's competitor, the Latecoere 631, had been withdrawn from Air France service, just 13 months after commencing operations. This was due to a disastrous series of accidents that resulted in the aircraft not only being uneconomical to operate, but also downright dangerous. Of the 11 Latecoere 631s that were built, 5 of them were lost in accidents. Examinations had revealed a truly frightening flaw. When the 631 was at its cruising speed, its engines operated at 1,925 RPM, and with its reduction gear, this turned the propellers at 840 RPM. Now this just so happened to also match the critical resonant frequency of the aircraft's wings and its control surfaces, which had a frequency of 840 cycles per minute. This vibration, transmitted from the propellers to the wings, gradually fatigued parts of the aileron control system until they ultimately failed. The ailerons, free of restriction, would then flutter at this resonant frequency, leading to a total loss of aircraft control. In the simplest of terms, the Latecoere 631 was literally vibrating itself to death. And the most terrifying part about this whole thing was that the pilots would not have been aware of this until the very moment when it was too late, as up until the critical moment of failure, the vibrations destroying the control surfaces were indistinguishable from the vibrations caused by the engines and propellers. And so, the story of not only the Amphitrite, but of all 3 French giant flying boats met an unceremonious, underwhelming, and sometimes tragic end. A real shame, considering for their time they were awe-inspiring and truly beautiful machines. But, as it turned out, the short-lived popularity of the transatlantic flying boat, combined with the effects of the Second World War, was just too much of a setback for any of these aircraft to endure. Not only did it mean that they had to wait for over a decade from conception to enter service, but they also did not receive adequate testing in order to try and make up for lost time, which was arguably why the Latecoere 631 in particular ended up having an awful track record of accidents during its short service life. But putting aside its ignominious fate, the SE200 and its cousins was a beautiful example of that brief era that saw the emergence of the giant commercial flying boat, a period that spans approximately 20 years from 1929 to 1949. Though others, such as the Dornier DO-X, the Boeing 314 Clipper, and the Saunders Roe Princess, to name just a few, have attained much more fame, despite many having limited or zero commercial success, the French flying boats have often been sorely neglected. So hopefully today's video has shed a bit more light on this neglected topic, and it's definitely something we'll be exploring in greater detail in the future. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters. Feedback on the use of 3D models in these videos has been almost unanimously positive, so that is something I'm going to continue to do. It's especially useful for aircraft like the SE200 where there isn't a huge photographic record to draw on, and as I get better with my 3D software we might see some fancy animations included as well. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. Now, I am making some changes to how the voting system is being done on Patreon moving forward, so if you haven't seen it yet, please go and check out the most recent post on there to get up to speed. Follow-up posts and some new votes will go up later on next month. But, as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, it means the world to me, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.